Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Yevamot Memchet. Shavua Tov to everyone. Hope you all have a nice Chag, and we're getting back to regular learning. Okay, we're starting with the bottom of Mem Zayin Amud Bet. Okay, I'm going to review the end of yesterday's sugya, which is Echad Ger ve'Echad Eved Meshuchrar. That's a quote from the Breita that started at the bottom of Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, continued through to the top of Mem Zayin Amud Bet, which is all about what the process done when a convert comes to convert. What we do, we ask all these questions, we say this, we do that, we give them a brit milah, we put them in the mikvah, and they have to accept upon the mitzvot. And then after the whole thing, it says, same thing for not only a ger, also for an eved meshuchrar. Remember, this is an eved knaani, which we're going to deal with a lot today. And we're going to learn some interesting things that we didn't know before about an eved knaani. Normally, we assume you purchase this eved from either a Gentile or a Jew. If you purchase them from a Gentile, then you're going to have to circumcise them and put them in the mikvah. And what they're saying here is, if you are to free them later, when you free an eved knaani, what happens? When you free them, the whole idea is that they become part of your household and they have all sorts of benefits besides, right? They're not just a slave that we torture and, things like that. No, they work for us. We gain all the benefits, proceeds of everything they do, but they in turn get taken care of and all that. And there's all sorts of rules about it. Then if we are to free them, then what happens? They become a full-fledged Jew, but in order to become a full-fledged Jew, they have to undergo conversion again. Like not exactly conversion, because they've already done circumcision, but they need to go in the mikvah again. And the assumption here is that what they're saying is not only do they need to go in the mikvah, but the last thing that was just mentioned in the Breita before it said this line was Kabbalat mitzvot. They also have to say, I accept upon me mitzvot, because they're basically going through a conversion. Well, that's the line that's going to give us a lot of issues. Do they really have to accept mitzvot? Right? They were already somewhat, right? They were part of our household. They kept all the mitzvot other than, remember, they're exempt only from mitzvot aseh shazman grama, time-bound, right? Positive time-bound commandments. So what's this? Do they really need Kabbalat mitzvot? Do they not? This seemed to indicate, again, I have to say very clearly, it seemed to indicate, because it's not clear, because it doesn't say that, it just says, this is true also. The question is, what is this? And after going through an entire amud, we're going to go through one whole page of trying to figure out, how is it really true that they have to accept mitzvot? We're in the end going to reject it and say that's not really what that line meant. But until we get there, it's going to take us a little while. So the Gemara starts off with saying very important words, right, for this whole section, which is we're 7 lines from the bottom of Mem Zayin Amud Bet. When they said echad ger echad eved meshuchrar, the same is true for both. They assumed it meant accepting mitzvot. Uraminu, and that contradicts the following thing. Says in a different Breita, that's only true for a ger. Says in a different Breita that when it's a slave that we're freeing, they don't need to accept mitzvah. So Amar Rav Sheshet, he's going to come up with the first answer. Lo kashya, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Rabbanan. It's a basic machloket, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Rabbanan. One Breita follows Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, one Breita follows the rabbis. What's the machloket? Well, it doesn't actually have to do with the same exact case, has to do with an Eshet Yafat Torah. Okay, so again, this is a very troublesome section in the Torah where it talks about, troublesome in one sense, maybe less troublesome in another sense, which is if you go out to war and you find a beautiful woman and you want to marry her, or maybe you don't want to marry her, you want to just sleep with her, but, right, which often happens in war, right, it's very common. The Torah has a different approach. And this is why on the one hand, it's a bit disturbing. On the other hand, it's saying, well, we're going to give you a way to do this within a framework that's appropriate. So she's going to have to go through this process, right? So we let her, we're going to see, grow her nails, cut her nails. We're going to see this machlokot later today. So she's going to go through some process where she kind of, and we'll see that, she makes herself look a little, she shaves off her head, right? We want her to look a little bit ugly so that maybe you realize, okay, well, maybe I don't really want this woman. And then she cries for her parents for a certain period of time. We'll see exactly how long a period of time. The standard is, let's just say 30 days, although we're going to see there's a big machloket about all this. And then basically, if you still are interested in marrying her at that point, you can basically have her, but she becomes your wife. You can't just, it's not like random, you have to make her your wife. Okay, so it's a bit of a process. It's a bit of a strange concept, the whole thing, but it's the Torah's answer to, what goes on in society. So when it comes to this, it says, Titania, the Breita says about this, By the way, this is all if she doesn't want to convert. If she wants to convert right away and she wants to become Jewish, you find this woman, you fall in love with her. I don't know if you call falling in love or whatever happens. She says, I'm happy to become Jewish and be part of your community. No problem. Okay. But aval kibla aleha, right? Matbila mutalamiyah, right? So if she does, she becomes permitted immediately. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer says, I'll give you another shortcut. Okay. If you want to avoid this process, okay, if she converts, obviously everybody agrees, no problem. But I'll give you another way. You can do exactly what we've been discussing. Make her shifcha knanit. Then once you do that, she's already, right? You don't need Kabbalat Mitzvot. There's a great way to avoid this issue of how it's difficult to get people to avoid Kabbalat Mitzvot. So I'll mention in a nutshell, there's some people who suggest that this is a good way to resolve the problem in Israel, right? It's a crazy idea to think we're going to turn someone momentarily into a Canaanite slave, okay? But it has been suggested to maybe do this because this is the way you avoid the problem that not everybody who wants to be considered Jewish wants to keep mitzvot, right? So now, you have them, you basically can avoid it according to Rabbi Shimon. First tovel her to become a shifcha knani. Then 5 minutes later, right, she was a shifcha knani. Now tovel her to free her. And basically free her as a slave. Then she goes in the mikveh and then she's fully Jewish. And then she doesn't need Kabbalat Mitzvot. Now, the assumption here is that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar clearly holds Kabbalat Mitzvot is fine. The rabbis who don't suggest this option, Tanakama's position, obviously hold that it's not okay. And there you have your machloket. One says you need Kabbalat Mitzvot. That's Tanakama, and therefore they don't suggest this as a possibility. One says you don't need Kabbalat Mitzvot, and Rav Shimon ben Elazar says you don't, and therefore this is a good option. Okay, so that's your machloket. Sounds pretty clear cut, but Amar Rava, and here before we reject this, we're going to first go a little bit more in depth into their opinions. Where do they get this from? So Amar Rava, my Tamid Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Dichtiv, he's going to darshan a particular pasuk in a particular way. The rabbis are going to say, no, we don't darshan the pasuk that way, and that's going to be their machlok. So there's a pasuk that says, it's actually about Pesach, okay, we just finished Pesach. The pasuk says, Kol eved ish miknat kesef, okay, it's Shemot chapter 12, pasuk 44. Any eved ish, any slave of a man, miknat kesef, who becomes his possessions, right, because you buy the slave, umaltauto, you give him you circumcise him, as yohalbo. And once he's circumcised, he can eat with the korban pesach with you. And it's the whole idea that this circumcision allows him entry into Jewish life, and then he can eat your korban pesach with you, etc. So what they're going to be struggling with is what's this term eved ish? Eved ish sounds like the slave of a man. So it's interesting. You might say, well, why not slave of a woman? Well, because Torah doesn't usually talk in the terms of woman. But the Braita is particularly bothered by, is particularly claiming in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar that he's bothered by the words, Kol eved ish mikna kesef, eved ish velo eved isha. A woman can own slaves also. So why is it only eved ish? What they're really saying is, why did you add the word ish? Eved would just be slave. It would have been enough. We know what we're talking about. So why does it specifically say slave of a man? What, slave of a man, not slave of a woman? It could be slave of a woman also. So why does it say that strange? Why is that strange terminology used? So what do they answer? Ela eved ish atamal ba'al korcho. You can circumcise the eved ish, which basically is going to be saying a Canaanite slave. But you can't do a brit milah to the son of a person and against his will. Now, what is that talking about? So it's not exactly clear, different interpretations. Some people explain that it means as opposed to a convert. In other words, the son or the son of a convert. If a convert wants to convert and convert his family, and the son doesn't want to convert, assuming the son's of age, the son can say, I don't want to convert. Okay, but an Eved can't say that. Okay, and Eved is basically, right, because again, what does this mean? This means that the Eved doesn't need to have Kabbalah mitzvot, because if you could do it against their will, that means they don't need to accept mitzvot upon themselves. So basically, you have this issue that's where you get it from the pasuk, Eved ish and not ben ish. A ben ish need, right, because again, the pasuk seems to say umal ta'uto, you give him a brit milah, doesn't matter what he's interested in or not. Okay, we're going to get to later today, what if he really doesn't want to? And there's a whole machloket about what we do about that. But right now we're assuming Eved Ish can be, now what this means, he can be circumcised against his will, which they take to mean also, which means when you free them, they can become Jewish basically without Kabbalat Mitzvot. The Rabbanan, so what do the rabbis do with this verse? Amar Ula, Kashem she'yeh tamal ben ish ba'al korcho, kach yeh tamal ben Eved ish ba'al korcho. The rabbis say, you can't just convert this person against their will. Ve'ela haksiv kol Eved ish, so what do you do with that? He's going to have a different way to darshan it, and he's going to rely on, this is chronologically, okay, the rabbis come before Shmuel, but we're going to say the same way we see Shmuel darshan this must be the way the rabbis darshan. Comes teach you a different halacha. When you own an Eved and you want to free that Eved, again, we're talking about a non-Jewish slave. When you want to free that Eved, what do? You have to give him a get shiur, like a divorce with a woman, right? You have to give the slave a document of freedom. But if you are mafkir your Eved and you say, I don't want to have any ownership rights, right? This is kind of right like we do now with Shemitah, we're mafkir our fruits. We say they're ownerless. We render them ownerless. If you do that, like let's say you say, all my possessions, I'm mafkir, okay, I'm giving up my rights to, and in that you have slaves. So if you do that, you don't need to give him a get shiur. Doesn't need that document. Why? Why not? Shene'amal kol Eved ish miknat kesef. So again, they ask the same question. Eved ish v'lo Eved isha. Ela Eved sheyesh lo reshut l'rabo alav karoi Eved. V'she'en reshut l'rabo alav ein karoi Eved. When they say Eved ish, what does it mean? The Eved who belongs to an ish. If he doesn't belong to the ish, because the ish rendered him ownerless, the person rendered him ownerless, then he's not an Eved. Okay, so we now have two different ways of darshaning the pasuk. Again, this thing about the get shiur is not really so interesting to us. It's just a different way to darshan Eved ish, which means he doesn't darshan it, but you can make them Jewish without them doing Kabbalat mitzvot, okay, without them accepting mitzvot. According to Tanakama, who doesn't darshan it that way, darshan it some other way, then you can't learn that from here, in which case they need Kabbalat mitzvot just like a convert. So we're back to saying that we have a machloket. Again, Rav Sheshet's answer to this two brighta. We had two brighta. One said the Eved is just like a ger, which we assumed meant you need to accept mitzvot. That will be Tanakama in this Isha Yifat Toar, right, where he doesn't suggest why don't we make her shivcha, free her. And the other brighta, which says you don't need Kabbalat mitzvot, and that matches Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who darshaned it from this pasuk Eved ish. Matkifla Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, I don't know what you're talking about. You can't compare the machlok of Rav Shimon ben Elazar and the rabbis in Eshet Yifat Toar to a regular Canaanite slave, because it's not the same thing. When the rabbi said you can't do this, this thing that I said, maybe some people say, let's do it nowadays. Let's just turn them into a Canaanite slave for 5 minutes, then put them in the mikvah a second time, and they'll do it without Kabbalat mitzvot. That's ridiculous. But that's only by it, right? It's a ridiculous suggestion because why? Because you're talking about an Eshet Yifat Toar. Delo shaycha b'mitzvot. She had nothing to do with mitzvot until this day. And now you're going to stick her in the mikvah, right? And do hocus pocus and, right, we can make her Jewish. That's ridiculous. But, Eved, to shayach b'mitzvot, hachanamida, filu rabbanan modu. But maybe the rabbis will agree that when it comes to Eved Knani, who lived in your house for who knows how many years and has been keeping mitzvot, right? Just not the time-bound ones that are positive time-bound commandments, like women, right? They're part of they've been in your house. They've lived through your life cycle events. And now you're freeing them, and now they're going to become Jewish. They might not really need Kabbalat mitzvot, even if you think that the Eshet Yifat Toar does, because you're comparing two very different situations. And how do I know this? Because he brings a braita to prove it. I'm going to prove to you that the rabbis would agree in a Eved Knani case, because it says here in a braita, echad ger, echad lokech eved min ovei kochavim, tzarich lekabel. Who needs to accept all mitzvot? Number one, a convert, a regular convert. Number two, someone who purchases a slave from a Gentile owner. Now, the assumption is it doesn't say so, but you have to, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. and you free him immediately, okay? So you buy someone from Novei Kochavi, which would be exactly like the Yifat Toar, right? Where you weren't part of Judaism at this point. You bought them and then you immediately freed them. It's a little bit strange it doesn't say that but otherwise it doesn't make any sense. So now they say, what is inferred from this though? That if you purchase them from a Gentile owner and you free them immediately, they're going to need Kabbalat Mitzvot. But it sounds like if you purchase them from another Jew, they would, and then you free them immediately, you wouldn't need Kabbalat Mitzvot. So, Halokach Yisrael ain't sarich lekabel. You wouldn't need that. Now, the question is, who's the author of this Braita? So now we're going to say, well, it's obviously not Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, because remember what he said. Even if it's this Eshet Yifat Torah had nothing to do with mitzvah, you could still purchase her and free her immediately. So, right, it's not purchasing in this case, but it would be turn her into an Evet Knani and then free her. Or Shivcha Knani. So he says, Rabbi Shimon ben right, Mani, who is this according to? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Ha'amar lokach min Oved Kavim nami en tzarich lekabel, right? If you purchase someone from a Gentile, or you take this woman who is in captivity, you could free her immediately and she'll be Jewish without Kabbalat Mitzvot. So Elalav Rabbanan, it must be the rabbis. And again, what's inferred from here? Shema Mina, you can learn from here. Alokech min Oved Kochavim tzarich lekabel. Avalokech mi Yisrael ein tzarich lekabel. But the inference was only if you, right? It said only if you purchase from a Gentile, which means if you purchase from a Jewish owner, you wouldn't need Kabbalat Mitzvot if you freed them. So therefore, that's the rejection of Rav Sheshet, because again, the machloket, Rav Shimon ben Elazar and the rabbis, by Eshet Yifat Torah is not the same machloket. It's not the same issue as by us. Because by us, they were already part of Judaism, and maybe the rabbis would even agree. So now we're stuck, because we're stuck with our original question. I told you we had a whole amud basically till we get to our answer, which is, it said Echad ger v'echad ever mishukrar. Until now, we've been assuming that's in the Braita from yesterday, and that we're assuming that means they need Kabbalat Mitzvot just like a convert. Now they say, so now Elakashya. So what are we going to do with this Echad ger v'echad ever mishukrar, which again goes against the explicit Braita, which says they don't need Kabbalat Mitzvot. So we have those two Braita contradicting. So the easier way to answer is Kitanya Linyan Tfilatanya. When it said the ger and the ever mishukrar have the same law, what they meant is they both need to immerse in a mikveh. In other words, like freeing your Gentile, your Canaanite slave doesn't immediately with a snap of a finger make them Jewish. They have to undergo an immersion in the mikveh. They don't need Kabbalat Mitzvot. That's not what we were talking about. When it said they also need to undergo a process, they meant you have to go in the mikveh. They didn't mean you also have to accept mitzvot. And with that, they resolved the question in a much simpler manner. And we could have really started here, but again, they wanted to probably close off all possibilities. Okay. Now that we've talked about this Eshet Yifat Torah, we're going to get into some more details about her. What kind of process does she undergo? By the way, I brought the verses in the psukim at the bottom of today's sheet. So first these and then some appear for later in today's daf, but they're all at the end there about basically the psukim describing, and I'm not going to go through them all inside, but we're going to darshan some of them right now. So the first two, we're going to have three machlokot here, three debates. The first two are between the same people. Okay, they're between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. And then the last one is between Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who we've been dealing with before, and the rabbis. Tanu Rabbanan, v'gilcha et rosha, okay, you shave off her head, mentioned this before, va'asta et tziporneha, and you do her nails. Okay, what does it mean you do her nails? Okay, it doesn't mean what we do nowadays if you do your nails, right? That would mean making them look nice, but it's very unclear what you do to her nails. So we're going to have a machloket. Rabbi Eliezer Omer takotz. We cut them, right? You cut them really short, right? Women like long nails, right? It's obviously uglier to have short nails. Well, not so obvious. We'll see in a minute. Rabbi Akiva Omer tagdel, okay, or tigadel. She will grow her nails long. You make her grow them. You don't let her cut her nails. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. How do I learn what I learned? It says, shave your hair, which obviously means remove your hair. And then astad tzipornei, you're supposed to do one thing to one thing to the other. It must be the same idea. So just like you shave off your hair, you take off your nails. Mal halan ha'avara, to remove, right? Afkan ha'avara, here it must be also to remove. Rabbi Akiva Omer, here you see culturally, maybe things were a little different than nowadays. Ne'amar asiyah berosh v'ne'amar asiyah b'tzipornei. Mal halan nivul, afkan nivul. Why do we shave her hair? To make her look ugly. Why do we grow her nails? To make her look ugly. In other words, growing nails would make you look ugly. Okay, so Urayala divrei Rabbi Eliezer, we're going to see a proof for the first opinion. If Mephibosheth goes down to the king and he doesn't, right? He looks very unkempt. What does he do? He doesn't do his feet, meaning his toenails, but he doesn't cut them. And he doesn't cut his mustache. So what do you see? The asa here appears in both, right? So here again, it's clear because it says asa, lo asa sfamo means he didn't shave it off. That means he didn't cut his nails either. Not the clearest proof, but that's what they assume. And that's his proof. Okay, we don't have a proof for Rabbi Akiva. Again, you have to understand culturally, obviously, longer nails were uglier. I was thinking also it could be like if your nail cracks, you can't fix it, maybe something like that. Okay. Tanu Rabbanat. Ubachta et avia ve'etima. This is an interesting drasha. She's supposed to cry for her mother and father, right? So that means you're basically taking her away from her family, and she needs to cry over that. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, avia mamash, ima mamash. Okay, he understands it according to the simple reading. This means she cries for her mother and father. Rabbi Akiva Omer, avia ve'ima zo avodah zara. Very interesting. So she's not crying over her parents and her leaving her family. She's crying over the loss of her religion. She's now moving into a different religion and she has to cry over that. Where do you get that Avia and Ima are her idols? Because it says, there's a pasuk in Yirmiyahu chapter 2. Omrim la'etz aviata. Okay, they don't bring the whole pasuk, but the continuation is ula'even at yiladitani. Okay, we say to the tree, which the people are worshiping, you're my father. And to the stone, which also people are worshiping, you gave birth to me, right? You birthed me. So basically we have the mother and the father. So there you have it, that both are, right? That she's crying over her idols rather than her actual parents. Yerach Yami, third machloket. Okay, so that was also Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva. Now we're moving to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar and the rabbis. Yerach Yami, Yerach Shloshim Yom. Yerach is like Yerach, the moon. The moon, the cycle of the moon is 30 days. So Yerach Yamim is a month, 30 days. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer Tish'im Yom. I say it's 90 days. Where does he get 90 days? Well, it says in the pasuk Yerach Yamim. So Yerach is Shloshim, that's 30. Yamim means add on another 30. Shloshim, another 30. Ve'achar ken, okay, the pasuk says, if you look inside, it's 21, chapter 21 in Devarim. And then it says, right, he brings her to the house, shaves off her head, all that. And then it says, V'yashva bebeitecha, she sits in your house, ubachta et avia ve'et ima yerach yamim, I'm in verse 13. Ve'achar ken tavo elehu v'alta, then you can sleep with her, v'ayta lecha lisha, and she'll become your wife. So now, what does this mean? This means, well, acharechen, after that, meaning after we had the Yerach, we had the Yamim, which is, again, what's the issue with Yamim? It's plural. So it means double that. And then after that, after adds another 30 days. So here comes a good question on this. Matkifla Ravina. Ema Yerach Shloshim, Yamim Shloshim, V'achar ken kihane. If you're going to say, and after that is referring to what was said before, after that shouldn't be another set of 30, it should be 60, because you did 30 and 30. And then after that, if you're trying to add, after that would sound like another 60. So if you're going to say what you're going to say, it really should be 120 and not 90. So kasha, in fact, it's a bit of a difficulty. They leave it as a question on that opinion. Okay, now we're back to Evet Knani. Now we're going to get into a whole issue about, and this is very fascinating because we always talk about Evet Knani. They come into your house, you purchase them, you give them a Brit Milah, you put them in the mikveh, right? They're keeping mitzvot in your house, right? They can eat your korban pesach, all of that. Now there's a question. What if they don't do a Brit Milah? Okay, let's say they didn't, you didn't give it to them. Okay, we're going to get to what if they don't want to. So can you keep them as a slave? Is there such a thing as an Evet Knani without a Brit Milah? Okay, they obviously, let's say, can't eat your korban pesach, but can they stay in your house? So Tanu Rabbanan, Mikaimim avadim she'ena mulim. You can keep Canaanite slaves that are not, right, that are not circumcised. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. That's what Rabbi Yishmael says. Rabbi Akiva Omer, ein mekaimim. You cannot keep them. Amar lo Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael says, but the Torah refers to these kind of people. How do I know? Okay. Shaharehu Omer, v'yinafesh ben amatecha. So now, let's look at the verses. Okay, for this, I want to read them all inside. Okay, so in Devarim, chapter 5, Pasuk Yubet, okay, we're in the Aseret HaDibrot. Sheshet yamim tavo v'asita kol melachtecha, right? You should work for 6 days and do all your work. V'yom hashvi shabbat l'Hashem Elokecha, lo taseh kol melacha, ata, you, ubincha, your son, ubitecha, your daughter, ve'avdecha, your slave, ve'amatcha, right? So you have your slave and your female, your ama. These are obviously not avadim knanim, avadim ivrim. They're not Jewish slaves because Jewish slaves are commanded for Shabbat in any case. This is saying even your Canaanite slaves. Now this makes perfect sense with everything we've learned because they're obligated in mitzvah, so they're obligated in Shabbat. So they can't work on Shabbat. Okay, then it says, B'shorcha v'chamucha, right? And your animals also have to rest. We learned all about that in Masechet Shabbat. Okay, that vigircha shir b'sharecha. This isn't relevant to our purposes, but the Gemara is going to go into it, so I want to point it out as well. And the ger who lives in your gates. Okay, now, and then it says l'man yanuach avdecha v'amatcha kamocha. Okay, they have to rest just like you do. So they're commanded to rest on Shabbat, which means also no malacha. In Shmo Perek Kaf Gimel, it says, there it's talking about Shemitah. Okay, the first two psukim in chapter pasuk 10. Shesh shanim tizrat artzecha v'asafta tfuata. 6 years you plant your land. V'ashvi'it tishamtena u'nitashta. Okay, and then the Evyonim they eat. Right, the poor people can come get your stuff. Okay, then in verse 12 it says Sheshet yamim ta'aseh ma'asecha. Very similar to the one in Dvarim. 6 days you should do your work. Uvayom shvi'it tishpot leman yanuach shorcha v'chamocha v'yinafesh ben amatecha v'hagel. Okay, in order that your animals will rest and your slaves, right, the son of your maidservant, who's your slave, and the ger. Okay, now, many times in Sefer Dvarim, there's repetition of things that were in Sefer Shmot, and there's all ways to kind of deal with it. Okay, there's different kinds of approaches. The approach of our Gemara is going to be to say, there's no reason for this repetition, if not that it's adding or talking about somebody else, because both talk about the ger and both talk about the eved, and it's this exact same thing, and therefore they must be talking about different types of avadim and different types of gerim. Okay, different types of converts, different types of slaves. So again, the main topic we're dealing with is the slaves. Since they're already bringing up this drasha, they're going to talk about the convert as well. Also, we were in the topic of converts, but this sugya happens not to be, but they will get to it. So now, Amar lo Rabbi Yishmael, Harehu Omer v'yinafesh ben amatecha, which means we must be talking about a different kind of slave that was discussed in Dvarim. Dvarim, when it said avdecha v'amatcha, they mean the classic Canaanite slaves that we always know about that went through a Brit Milah. This Ben Amatecha must be one that didn't go through a Brit Milah, and there you have proof that you can keep them in your house, because otherwise, why are they keeping Shabbat if not that they're in your household? Comes Rabbi Akiva and he says, the verse is talking about a case where, and I agree with you that it's talking about an Evet that doesn't have a Brit Milah, but what's the situation? It's that you purchased him right before Shabbat in that Ben Hashmashot, where it's, Safek Yom, Safek Laila, we're not sure which one it is. You bought him right then, or right before. And then you didn't have time to do Brit Milah because Shabbat came in. And that's why he doesn't have a Brit Milah. So yes, you can keep him for the weekend, but that's it. By Sunday morning, he's got to have a Brit Milah. That's what his answer is. So first the Gemara points out, which is obvious, but they're going to talk about why this is. Notice everybody thinks it's obvious to them, right? Even though you would read this pasuk and you wouldn't have thought that's the reading of the pasuk if I hadn't told you this, right? You would have thought it's just talking about a classic Evet Knani. So he said, why does everyone assume that this is talking about an Evet that didn't have a Brit Milah? So now they're going to say, my mashma. Where did they get that from? Titania. So they say, it says in a Braita. This is your classic Midrash halacha structure, where it says we have a verse. The verse is coming to teach you this halacha. It's talking about an Evet Arel, and then it raises it as a question. Is it really talking about an Evet Arel? Remember, Arel means uncircumcised. How do you know it's talking about an Evet Arel? Right? Why do I say it's the classic structure? They tell you the punchline before they get to, right? Then they start questioning the punchline, and then they go back and they tell you, we're going to get there in the end. But right now we're going to suggest, how do we know? Maybe it's an Evet that was circumcised. So they say, no, because in Dvarim it already talked about, no, already, right? There's no order. We're in Shemot, which is before Dvarim. But the point is, in Sefer Dvarim, it already mentions that. It must be, okay? They say it as simply as I already explained it before. That's it. That's enough proof for them. That's because that's their approach. If it says it there, it can't possibly be meaning the same person here. And therefore, we're going to say one is talking about circumcised, one is uncircumcised. V'hager. Now we're going to do the same thing. We're in this Braita. I told you we're going to get to the ger, even though it's not our topic, because the Braita that says this, that we've quoted to prove about the Eved, is also talking about the difference between the ger. Ze ger toshav. What's a ger toshav? If I asked you, what would you probably tell me? A Gentile who keeps the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach. Okay, which is very interesting because Rashi here, it's a very famous Rashi, and I'll read it inside. Rashi, about 7 lines from the top of the page, maybe 8 lines, says ger toshav shekibel alav shalola avod avodah zara. Okay, ve'ochel nevelot. Okay, eats treif, but he doesn't worship avodah zara. Rashi seems to say one thing only. It doesn't say the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach. He calls it ger toshav, according to this Rashi here, as someone who keeps just, I don't worship idols, okay? Which is very interesting because that would make a lot of people in this category of ger toshav, especially nowadays. Many people don't worship idols in the world. Right? There are people who do, but many people don't anymore, right? In those days, that was the major religion. Anyway, it's just interesting. But ger toshav. Atal or ger toshav, oinu ela ger tzedek. Kishu omer begercha shebisharecha harei ger tzedek amor. Hani makayem v'hagir ze ger toshav. So again, he says, right, that we have this distinction. We have, right, one pasuk is saying the ger toshav, which by the way then says the ger toshav needs to keep Shabbat, right, which is very interesting in and of itself. And number 2, then we have the ger toshav, and then we have the ger tzedek, which is a regular convert, right? That's someone who converted to Judaism fully, what we call a convert. So we have, again, the pasuk is talking about 2 different types of people. Now, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Halokech eved min ha'ovei kochavim. Okay, so far what we've done in this section is we've mentioned there's a machloket, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael, about can you keep in your property, right? Can you have an eved Knani who doesn't undergo circumcision? Rabbi Akiva, no way, no how. Rabbi Yishmael, yes, and that's what the verse in Shemot was referring to. Okay, what did Rabbi Akiva say about that verse? Oh, that verse was just referring to, for a few minutes, for a day, because you bought him right before Shabbat and you didn't have an option to circumcise yet. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Now we're jumping up a few generations to Emoraim, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and he says, right, the truth is I have to look up this ger toshav. I see what you're asking. Rashi actually says, the rest of that Rashi says, the mechalel et Shabbat k'oved avodah zara. Yeah, the truth is what it means means the opposite of what I said. What the Torah is commanding you is that Leman, let me just read it inside. It says, Leman yanuach shorchava chamarchav yinafesh ben amatecha v'hager. So if I'm reading Rashi correctly, he says that he has to be mechalel Shabbat like an oved avodah zarah. It's sort of an exception to it. Yeah, sorry that I didn't explain that correctly. I see Tosfot. Right, I'm just looking at Tosfot for a minute. Right. So first of all, Tosfot says against Rashi, what do you mean? It's the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach. It's not just one. And he says, right, because Tosfot understands it literally. It says, Goy Shabbat chayav mita. So he basically questions it based on that. So maybe I'm not understanding Rashi correctly. Interesting. Tosfot says what it means is you can't do malacha for a Jew. That's interesting. And that's where he gets the whole Amir La'akum, that you can't tell a Gentile to do it. And that's how he understands it. So I'm not sure if I'm understanding Rashi correctly that he's saying, so I didn't want to read it inside because I wasn't 100% sure. I'm not sure what he means exactly there. Okay, requires further research. Okay, so now let's get back. So we have this machloket, can you keep him or not? Comes Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi a few generations later, and a Morah from Israel. And he says, halokech, because remember, they're Tanaim, the machloket that we had before, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Akiva. Halokech even mina ovei kochavim v'lo ratza lamul, migalgel imo ad 12 chodesh. You bring this Eved Knani, now all of a sudden it's fascinating here, because we assumed he's your slave, you have all rights to tell him what to do. According to this, you buy him, and he says, listen, I really don't want to be circumcised. So what do? You wait 12 months, and you hope that he'll agree eventually to be circumcised. Lomal, if after 12 months he doesn't, then you have to sell him back Okay, here there's this in between, like a waiting period, as opposed to Rabbi Akiva, who said Ein Mekaymin at all, says you have 12 months. We're now going to have the exact same structure in the next section as well. We have a halacha. The rabbis are going to say this halacha to Rav Papa, and they're going to say, Keman, who does this go according to? Obviously, to Loka Rabbi Akiva. So obviously it doesn't match Rabbi Akiva, who says you can't keep him at all. To Rabbi Akiva, Hamar, Ein Mekaymin, who says you can't. Amar Lu Rav Papa, so Rav Papa's reaction to the people who come to him, he says, listen, I'm going to explain this even according to Rabbi Akiva. Afilu Tema Rabbi Akiva. Hanimile, and before I read the next words, I'm just going to tell you there's many different commentaries of how to understand these words and which is referring to which, but he's going to say that's only Hecha de lo Pascal and Milta. Aval Hecha de Pascal and Milta Pascal. I'll go with one of the interpretations, which is if he's very clear and firm and says no way, no how, then Rabbi Akiva says you can't keep him. But if he's wishy-washy and says maybe, then you can keep him for 12 months. If he doesn't do it after 12 months, even Rabbi Akiva will agree with that. So Rabbi Akiva said, Ein Mekaymin, it was someone who was definitively, I'm not going to ever do a Brit Milah. Okay, that's one way. There's a bunch of different ways of explaining this. I'm not going to get into it right now. Amar Rav Kahana. So Rav Kahana says, wait a minute. When I told this answer, Rav Papa just said that we could read this according to Rabbi Akiva, to Rav Zvit. He said to me, but if that's what Rabbi Akiva says, then we have a much better answer to the pasuk, v'yinafesh ben hamatecha. Instead of saying it's some random case where you happen to have bought him right, banish mashot, on Erev Shabbat, you could have explained like this. It's when you purchase one and he's not an Eved and he's not sure if he wants to convert or not. That would have been a much better explanation. So to which they answer, well, that was one answer, and there were more possible answers of how to read that verse. So that's not a contradiction. We're going to have the exact same structure in this next section. Shalach Rabin Mishmei Rabbi Eli. Rabin taught in the name of Rabbi Eli. B'chol Rabotai Amuli Mishmo, and he said, and all the rabbis told me in the name of Rabbi Eli, the following halacha. Ezehu Eved Arel Shemutar L'Kaimo. What's an uncircumcised servant, slave that you can keep? Zeh Shalakho Rabo Amanat Shelo L'Mula. Here's another exception to the rule. If you purchased him, this is also very interesting. Right? This breaks all of the things that we thought about in Eved Knani. You go to purchase this slave from a Gentile, and the Gentile says to you, I will sell it to you under condition that you don't circumcise him. Okay? In that case, you don't have to circumcise him, and you can keep him. So again, we're going to have Amarua Rabbanan Kameja Rav Papa. The rabbi said this must obviously be right. They go to Rav Papa and they say, Kemande Loka Rabbi Akiva. Dika Rabbi Akiva. Hamar Ein Mekaymin. This must go against Rabbi Akiva. Because Rabbi Akiva doesn't think you could ever keep an Eved Knani who doesn't have a Brit Milah. Amar le Rav Papa, afilu tema Rabbi Akiva. Again, Rav Papa comes and says, I can tell you, no, even Rabbi Akiva agrees. Rabbi Akiva, when he said you can't keep the Eved Knani, is saying only if you didn't make a condition, but if you stipulated that in the purchase, and even Rabbi Akiva would agree. It's fascinating, right? According to this, Rav Papa is saying everybody agrees that you could actually have an Eved Knani who doesn't do a Brit Milah if you purchase him as number one. If he was wishy-washy, you could keep him for the 12 months. And number two, if you made a stipulation in the agreement when you purchased him, if the person who sold it to you insisted on this stipulation, then you could keep him. Amar Rav Kahana. So again, same structure. Rav Kahana says, Amarita l'shmate kamedu Rav Ziv nahar de'ava Amar li ihachi ki ka'amar le Rabbi Akiva b'lokech eved ben hashmashot v'lo espik lemolo v'shane leha. He should have said, here's a case, right? When it says, what does it mean? In Eved, it didn't have a Brit Milah because it was stipulated in the contract. So why didn't he say that? To which the Gemara answers, according to you, you could have also said the previous answer, and we already said, right? He was just giving one possibility, but there were actually 2 or 3 possibilities because we just gave a bunch of other possibilities where Rabbi Akiva would agree. So again, according to Rav Papa, Rabbi Akiva would even agree that there are cases where you could keep the Eved Knani who doesn't have a Brit Milah. Yativ Rabbi Chanina, Bar Pape, Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, Akila, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Okay, so Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Chanina, Bar Pape are all sitting together by either on the merpeset, the porch, or something of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. There's a few different interpretations of what Kila is. And they said the following halacha. There was a whole community of people where the slaves kind of rebelled, right? They said, we're not doing circumcision. They tried for 12 months to get them, right? They kept them as their slaves for 12 months. But in the end, they sold them back to Ovdei Kochavim. Kiman, according to who? Ki hai Tana de Tanya. They're now going to show there's a machloka Tanaim about this. So what Rabbi Yeshua and Levi said, that you can wait the 12 months, is actually a Tanaitic debate, which appears in this bright. That's exactly what we saw. The Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who we already had a few times today, he disagrees. He says something very interesting. He says in Israel, we have to keep things tum'ah v'tahara. We're very careful about it, whether it's Kohanim or other people. Therefore, what's the issue? Ovdei Kochavim are considered tamei. Okay, they're considered always zavs. Okay, they have a status of a zav, and that's a rabbinic decree. And therefore, because of that, they're going to touch our things and mess them up. Here's another fascinating thing. If you live in a border town, okay, on the border with the other nations, we're worried he'll spy. Okay, if you live right near the border, we're worried that your slave will somehow get information out to the people on the border and they'll come and attack us, right? They'll know how to get to us. So there's all these reasons that they were concerned to keep these slaves. Again, once they circumcise them, they assume they're in. But if they don't, they're concerned that they're out. And number one, they'll mess up their taharot. And number two, right, they'll do other things. I was thinking about people who have, non-Jewish people working in their houses and they learn all the laws of kashrut and they learn, right? They could keep all that, right? It's fascinating, right? They know all that stuff. Sometimes, they even know it better, right? They learn it and then they know it. So, but here it seems to be the taharot problem is not kashrus related. It's more that by halacha, right? If they're not circumcised, then they're tamei and then they're treated like Gentiles and then it's going to be a problem. Okay, Tanya, Rabbi Chananya benosha Rabban Gamliel Omer. Okay, we're going to end this sugya now before we get to the next Mishnah, which starts on the next page, about concluding the issue of converts. Okay, now they have a question. Why they asked this specifically about converts is a good question. I'll give you one option in a minute, but I'm sure there's many different answers to this question. Why are converts in our day and age? Why do they suffer and things come upon, right? Bad things come upon them. Now we ask this question about Jews as well, right? We ask why do good things happen to, right? Bad things happen to good people, all that, Sadiq Baralo. It could be, I think maybe the question is being asked because, a convert, like we were born into Judaism, but a convert came to it on their own. There's so much more reason to respect them and to think that they came to this on their own. You can see from the answers, it's almost getting at that they came to this on their own. And that's an unbelievable thing. Why would anyone like that ever have to undergo any sort of yisurim? So here are 4 answers. Okay. And with that, we'll end for today. Number 1, before they converted to Judaism, no, we don't know, but they might not have kept all the 7 Noachide laws. Rabbi Yossi Omer, what kind of a ridiculous answer is that? Right? They're not related to their relatives anymore. Of course, they're not connected to their sins anymore. They're like a newborn child. They've basically been born fresh, and therefore, we're born new. Therefore, they're no longer, they can't certainly be judged because of things they did then. So why does he think? Right? There's so many details of mitzvot. So even if you try to learn them all, you can't learn them all in a certain period of time, right? It's hard. They don't necessarily know all the details. Whereas if you're brought up with it, you know them much more because you've been brought up. Obviously, one can argue with this argument for sure. Also an interesting assumption, right? They came to it out of fear, not out of love. Okay, I don't know why they assume that, right? But that's an assumption he maybe makes. Or again, it could be not all converts, but it could be some of them came out of fear. And therefore, right, they saw the Jews, winning, I don't know, and this and that, and say, oh, I want to be on that side. I'm scared that if I don't. Anyway, maybe that's one reason. Because they waited. They converted. Whenever they converted, it was a day later than they should have, or 10 days later, or 3 years later. And why didn't they do it earlier? Okay, and that's it. Yes, they did an amazing thing, but they could have done it earlier, and maybe that's why. Okay, so now where does he get this from? Amar Rabbi Abahu, V'Tamar Rabbi Chanina, Ma'ikra. There's a pasuk that shows this. It says, Yishalem Hashem, we're in Sefer Rut, okay, right? We know that. Yishalem Hashem palech, timas kortech shlemami im Hashem Elokei Israel, asher bat lachzot tachat knafav. So where do we learn it from here, right? It's basically about Ruth saying, you will get rewarded because you came under the Shekhinah, right? So asher bat, Rashi says, shemihart v'lo echart, because you rushed to do it and you didn't wait. If you had waited, so you were right. Boaz says it. Thank you. So Boaz says this, right? You should be rewarded because you did this and you came quickly. So the idea is that if you didn't come quick enough, then maybe that's what you're suffering for. So 4 potential reasons as to why there might be suffering among converts, when maybe, you would think they don't deserve it. So the point is, right, the last one at least is you should have hurried to do it. Every day you'd waited, right, is basically, right. So now you have to blame all the people who make the conversion process too long. They're actually causing the converts to sin more. Okay, with that, we'll finish for today. Have a great day, everyone. Shabbat tov.